ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that Drew hadn't expected the word, yes, to come so quickly, so easily, or so quietly. It didn't come with a smile. It didn't come with tears. It came with a silence that lingered in the air like smoke from a house fire, thick, choking, and unnatural. Willow stood there, still in the emotional wreckage of her custody hearing. Her heart not even healed from the blow of losing Wiley and Amelia. And yet there she was, agreeing to marry the very man who had become the final pillar holding up the illusion of control in her unraveling life. But what Drew saw as a victory was, in truth, the beginning of something far more disturbing. Because when Willow said, yes, something inside her shut off. On the surface, this was supposed to be the remedy. A strategic engagement. A way to rebuild her image before the court, to convince the judge she had structure, that she had support, that she had the moral foundation necessary to reclaim her children. But underneath that thin veil of reasoning lay a deeper truth. Willow didn't understand why she had said yes. She didn't trust it. It didn't feel like her decision. It felt like a reflex, like blinking in the face of a sudden flash of light, or gasping when submerged underwater. And Drew, watching her nod with that distant look in her eyes, mistook that silence for gratitude. He didn't see the paralysis. He didn't sense the dread crawling up her spine. What Willow couldn't yet name was that she had become the subject of a much deeper manipulation, one that had been quietly shaping her world since the moment she chose to trust Drew over Michael. Over Jason, even over her own instincts. The illusion of safety that Drew created was carefully curated, measured out like sedatives given to a patient resisting surgery. He was not just offering her a marriage. He was offering her a correction, a restructuring of her narrative, a recalibration of how she appeared to the world and to herself. And Willow, lost in her desperation to be seen as a fit mother, accepted that adjustment without understanding its price. Because this wasn't just about Drew saving Willow. This was about Drew rewriting her. The first signs were subtle. The way he began to speak for her in conversations. The way he carefully avoided mentioning Nina, deflecting every opportunity for Willow to ask questions. He kept her busy, charity events, media appearances, meetings with lawyers, even therapy sessions with hand-picked professionals who emphasized forward motion and discouraged dwelling on the past. Drew wasn't comforting Willow's grief, he was burying it. He was muting her, smoothing the jagged edges of her rage and sorrow into something more manageable. More palatable for the custody battle ahead. But in doing so, he was turning Willow into a mannequin, a hollowed-out version of herself dressed in optimism she didn't feel. And the worst part? She didn't notice it happening. Because when trauma fractures the mind, it doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it presents itself as gratitude for being rescued. Or shame for needing to be. Sometimes it manifests as obsessive attachment, not to love, but to structure, to anything that seems stable. Drew had learned this. Drew had studied this. And now he was applying it. Each day after the engagement, Willow found herself more detached from her memories, from her questions, from the fiery defiance that had once defined her. She stopped asking why Drew had suddenly re-emerged as her savior. She stopped asking why Nina looked haunted every time she saw them together. She stopped wondering why Jason's warning had been so sharp, so desperate. It was easier to believe that this was love. It was safer to believe that Drew was her lifeline. But deep in the corners of her mind, doubt was beginning to move. Not as a scream, but as a pulse. A rhythm. A sense that something had been rewritten in her while she wasn't looking. And Drew knew it. Every time he held her hand in public, every time he posed with her in court, he could feel it, the weight of the power he now had. But power, once tasted, demands more. And Drew began to shift again. No longer content to simply guide her, he started to erase parts of her. Her conversations with Jason became strained. Her connections to old friends diminished. Even her relationship with Wiley and Amelia was becoming conditional. Drew positioned himself as the gatekeeper, the protector. The man who could either reunite her with her children or keep them further away, depending on how obedient she remained. Willow, once a woman of fire and conviction, was now navigating a maze of invisible walls. She was trying to convince herself she was in love while slowly realizing she was being reshaped. And the realization came like a shadow falling across a mirror, subtle, then overwhelming. She began to wake in the middle of the night with no memory of falling asleep. She found herself rehearsing what to say before speaking, second-guessing her own thoughts. She saw Drew watching her sometimes, not with love, but with calculation. As if she were a project. As if she were something he was still refining. And that's when the obsession began. Not hers, his. Drew's desire to control Willow masqueraded as protection. He curated her life. Filtered her communications, even monitored her medication under the guise of supporting her recovery. But it was all a lie, one built on a foundation of betrayal she had yet to uncover. Because the truth, the one she couldn't see, was that the man she was about to marry had once slept with her mother. The woman who stood beside her at her lowest moments. The one she was still trying to forgive, had shared a secret with Drew so devastating that it could obliterate everything in an instant. But that secret was being hidden like a landmine. Placed quietly under the altar where she would one day say, "I do." And Willow, blinded by the illusion of redemption, kept walking toward it. There were signs, of course. Subtle hesitations in Nina's voice. The way Carly looked at Drew with silent contempt. The tight-lipped expressions of the Quartermaines whenever Drew mentioned fresh starts. But Willow, still reeling from the loss of her children and the emotional void that followed, was too fragmented to assemble those clues into meaning. Until one night, when she found a single photograph in Drew's drawer. A photograph of him and Nina. In bed. Smiling. Frozen, Willow stared at the image as if it were an artifact from another universe. Her entire body went numb. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't speculation. This was evidence. Proof. The man she had said yes to, the man she was allowing to rebuild her life, had already destroyed it in ways she didn't even know. And for the first time in weeks, Willow felt something real, rage. Not sorrow. Not confusion. Rage. Because this wasn't just betrayal. This was erasure. Drew had rewritten her story and cast himself as the hero, when in truth, he was the architect of her fall. He had seduced her mother, lied by omission, taken advantage of her grief, and weaponized her children to keep her compliant. But now, with that photo in her hand and fire in her chest, Willow was waking up. And when she did, Drew would discover that control is not love. That manipulation is not protection. And that a woman who has been gaslit, betrayed, and repressed will not remain silent forever. The question wasn't whether Willow would destroy the engagement. The question was, when she did, how much of Drew's world would burn with it? What began as a proposal wrapped in quiet desperation soon mutated into something far more sinister and calculated, something neither Drew nor Willow could fully control. Because this was no longer about love or healing or even redemption, it was about leverage, power, and image restoration in a world that feeds on perception more than reality. When Willow accepted Drew's proposal in that sterile, numb haze of exhaustion and grief, she did so not with her heart but with her survival instincts. Conditioned now to recognize that in Port Charles, especially when one is at the mercy of family courts and tabloid speculation, perception can outweigh truth and appearances can shape destinies. But that simple, soft-spoken yes, which might have seemed like a turning point toward hope, was in fact the spark that ignited a slow-burning fuse of silent war between two people who both thought they were using the other. Two people now so entangled in mutual manipulation and half-truths that they couldn't distinguish alliance from adversary. Drew, ever the strategist cloaked in charm, saw in Willow's fragile state an opportunity, not to rescue, but to reframe, because he understood, perhaps more than Willow herself did, that her vulnerability made her pliable. And pliability meant control, and control meant influence over the very narrative that had just condemned her in court and stripped her of the right to raise her own children. By stepping in with a ring and a promise of unity, he wasn't offering comfort, he was presenting a new version of Willow, one draped in the respectability of a quartermain connection. Polished by media consultants, reshaped into a woman the judge might reconsider, if not out of empathy, then out of optics. But Drew's game was not played in open air, it was orchestrated behind closed doors, built on omission and secrecy, layered with lies that Willow had not yet uncovered. Most devastatingly the truth that he had once slept with her mother, Nina, and had buried that betrayal beneath layers of performative chivalry and well-timed affection. And yet, Drew wasn't the only one recalibrating in real time, because Willow, stripped of children, reputation, and identity, was beginning to understand that survival in this arena demanded strategy just as much as sincerity, and if aligning herself with Drew could create the impression of stability, of upward momentum, then she would play along, but always with one eye open, one hand behind her back clutching the threads of her former self, ready to pull away the mask when the time was right. And so they both danced. Gracefully and publicly, but behind that choreography was a chess game filled with sacrifices and setups, and neither was prepared for how deeply that game would consume them. Drew began subtly isolating her, controlling the optics. Her interviews were curated, her wardrobe altered to fit a new maternal aesthetic, her talking points rehearsed and sanitized. Her legal strategy revised by his own team of lawyers, while he carefully monitored her access to friends, to Jason, to Nina, to even Carly, always with a smile, always under the guise of protection. But protection that felt increasingly suffocating. Meanwhile, Willow began quietly collecting data, revisiting Drew's financial records, noting inconsistencies in his business holdings. Noticing transfers and media funds and the sudden reappearance of shell companies that seemed designed to absorb scandal and deflect accountability, she saw that he wasn't just building a marriage. He was building a fortress, preparing for fallout, and somewhere in that fortress she suspected her own autonomy had been sealed away. And while both clung to the illusion of partnership, what they were really building was a psychological prison, with each attempting to lock the other inside first. Then came the anonymous leak, an untraceable rumor in a local paper suggesting a salacious entanglement between Drew and a woman linked to Nina. Vague enough to avoid litigation but pointed enough to start a fire, and suddenly, eyes turned to Willow again, not as a victim, not as a mother, but as a woman blindly engaged to a man whose past had begun to unravel in the public sphere. Drew went into crisis mode, controlling damage, crafting statements, coercing cooperation from allies while pressing Nina to issue a denial she couldn't bring herself to speak, and the more he tried to contain the truth, the more transparent the performance became. Willow, meanwhile, began unraveling at the seams, not out of shock, but out of confirmation, because her instincts had long whispered that something about Drew's affection was too rehearsed, too convenient, too weaponized. And yet she continued playing her role, knowing that leaving now, without a counter-narrative, without a strategy to reclaim her children, would be seen as weakness. And weakness was something the court would exploit again. The wedding was set. The guest list confirmed. The press invitation sent. And Port Charles braced itself for what was supposed to be a love story but was rapidly shaping into a televised implosion, because even as Willow stood before the mirror in her designer gown, her eyes reflected not anticipation but resignation, and Drew, watching her from the doorway, misread that silence as gratitude again, never sensing the rage slowly hardening beneath her skin. This wedding wasn't about union, it was about dominance, and every lace detail, every polished ring, every smile practiced in front of the cameras was a facade masking an internal war between two people who had both come to believe the other was the obstacle to salvation. Drew's obsession with control, masked as protection, had morphed into surveillance. He tracked Willow's location, her texts, her therapy sessions, while Willow, growing colder, sharper, and more deliberate, fed just enough affection to keep him convinced while preparing her next move, which would not be emotional but surgical. Behind the altar, behind the flowers and the photographers, sat the secrets, the affair with Nina, the manipulation of media outlets, the twisted custody agreement, the coercion of court-appointed specialists. The financial trail that Drew thought invisible, and worst of all, the slow erasure of Willow's agency, her instincts, her voice. The closer the vows came, the more obvious it became that this was not a marriage but a collision of egos, of obsessions, of delusions layered with strategy, and Willow knew, deeply, viscerally, that she could no longer allow this performance to continue. Whether it would be in the middle of the ceremony or in the final moments of rehearsal dinner, she wasn't yet sure. But the moment was coming, the moment where she would pull the thread that unraveled everything. Because Drew believed she needed him. But Willow was beginning to remember that she had once survived without anyone. And Drew, so consumed by the illusion of control, failed to see that Willow's silence was not submission, it was preparation. The reckoning wasn't a possibility anymore, it was a certainty. The pressure had reached critical mass. The adjustments they had each forced upon one another had created a narrative so warped, so poisoned, that the only possible outcome now was detonation. This was no longer a love story. It was a story of erasure, of psychological warfare disguised as commitment, of two people who thought they were saving each other while slowly destroying themselves. And when it all collapsed, when the cameras were rolling, when the altar was full, when the whispers turned into screams, there would be no one left standing who hadn't been scorched by the fire they both built. Drew believed he had crafted the perfect image. Willow was about to shatter it. And when she did, Port Charles would remember not the vows, not the dress, not the cake, but the explosion. The illusion that Drew Kane had so meticulously constructed, of control, of stability, of redemption through love, was about to detonate in a way more explosive than even his most paranoid calculations could have predicted. Because in the final hours before the wedding, just as the media began swarming Port Charles and the Quartermaine mansion overflowed with curious onlookers and forced smiles, a quiet alliance was forming between two women who had nothing in common except for one thing: they were both done being silent. Nina Reeves, once buried in shame and guilt, could no longer carry the weight of what she had done and what she had hidden, not just the affair with Drew, but the complicity in protecting his darker impulses when she still believed he was capable of love. And Tracy Quartermaine, always one to sniff out rot beneath a polished floor, had pieced together enough financial irregularities and personal inconsistencies to realize that Drew's motives for marrying Willow had far less to do with affection and far more to do with consolidation, of power, of influence, and of image manipulation on a scale that bordered on sociopathic. It began with a whispered conversation at the Metro Court, where Tracy confronted Nina not with accusations, but with facts, emails, bank transfers, anonymous company names linked to Drew's accounts, and a timeline that showed he had been orchestrating this engagement before Willow even lost custody. Nina, cornered, finally confessed, not just about sleeping with Drew, but about the calculated conversations they had about optics, about using Willow's vulnerability as leverage, about crafting a media strategy to rebuild his standing after years of moral decay hidden under layers of performative heroism. Tracy didn't need a moral reason to act, what she needed was clarity. And now she had it. Drew had become dangerous, not because he raised his voice or threw punches, but because he had mastered the art of appearing noble while quietly dismantling the lives of everyone around him. Together, Nina and Tracy began compiling the truth, not in anger, but in strategy, because in a town like Port Charles, justice was often theater. And the only way to destroy a man like Drew was to strip him bare in front of the same audience he had spent months convincing he was a savior. They chose the wedding as the battleground, because Drew himself had turned it into a media spectacle, and they would now use that spotlight against him. The morning of the ceremony, while Willow stood alone in her dressing room, staring into a mirror that no longer reflected the woman she once was, Tracy and Nina prepared their opening salvo. The guests had arrived. The press had begun to whisper. Jason stood at the back of the chapel, unease rippling through his stance, instinctively sensing that something was off, something was wrong. And then, just as Drew stood at the altar, eyes scanning the room like a general overseeing a battlefield he believed he already controlled, Tracy stepped forward, not with a scream, not with rage, but with a calm that cut sharper than any blade. She addressed the room, thanked them for coming, and then said what no one expected, that the wedding was postponed. That certain truths had come to light. That Willow had a right to know who Drew truly was. And then, Nina took the floor, not as the woman scorned, but as the woman who had once enabled the monster. Who had chosen silence over integrity, and who now understood the cost of complicity. She described the affair, not in lurid detail, but with the clinical clarity of someone freeing herself from chains she had helped fasten. She told Willow that the man standing at the altar had manipulated her grief, her longing for stability, and her desperation to reclaim her children, not to support her, but to use her as a prop in his own redemption narrative. Tracy followed with documents, financial records, communications, court lobbying strategies, and most damningly, a signed agreement between Drew and a media consultant outlining how to reshape the Willow Tate brand for public sympathy. The room fell silent. Willow, frozen in her gown, felt the walls close in, felt the echo of every decision she had questioned now find its answer in the cruelest possible form. She had not been saved. She had been branded, packaged, sold. And the man she thought was holding her hand through the storm had in fact been guiding her toward it. Drew, blindsided, attempted to spin. He called it misinformation. He accused Nina of vengeance. He tried to guilt Tracy with family legacy, but the facts stood taller than his voice, and the damage was already done. The press captured every moment. Jason stepped forward, not to fight, but to stand beside Willow, whose silence finally cracked into tears, not of sorrow, but of clarity. The wedding was over. The illusion shattered. And the town that had once whispered in speculation now roared in condemnation. But the explosion didn't end there, because Drew, cornered, didn't retreat. He lashed out. He threatened lawsuits. He accused Michael of orchestrating the whole thing to regain custody. He even claimed that Willow had known about the affair all along. A lie so transparent that even the most loyal Quartermain allies turned away. What had been a calculated climb back to influence had now become a freefall, and Drew, once the man everyone believed was a quiet hero, was now revealed as something far more dangerous, a manipulator who disguised control as love, a man who wrapped cruelty in concern, and a figure who would rather burn the world down than admit he had lost. Port Charles had seen many scandals, many implosions, but this was personal. Because Willow was not just another woman caught in a soap opera spiral, she was a mother, a survivor, and now, finally, a fighter reborn in fire. The courthouse reopened her custody hearing. The media reversed their narrative. Drew's deals collapsed. And Willow, though still shaken, finally stood tall, not as the bride, not as the victim, but as the woman who refused to be rewritten. And Tracy, watching it all unfold, simply said one thing to Nina as they turned and walked away: "That's what happens when you bet against the truth."